Here with another midweek meal prep. Hope you've gotten yourself a bite to eat and you're getting ready to get into God's Word. We're going to go ahead and pick up where we left off this past week. We are, of course, in a series in the Gospel of Mark. Let me get myself out of the way here. We are currently in Mark chapter 13. This week we're going to look at verses 24 through 37 with an asterisk. More on that in a second, but we're looking at November 9th already. We're getting close to the conclusion of this book. Before we continue, we want to go ahead and remind ourselves in terms of why we're doing this. It's because as a church, we're a community, a body of believers striving to be men, women, and children, bearing witness to Christ wherever we are and whatever we're doing. And then we're doing this by treasuring the truth, mastering or majoring in the gospel, making that the primary message of our lives, and then we respond appropriately by worshiping Jesus and growing together in communities of faith. And so we do this week in, week out, just 3 simple steps. The first thing we do is identify or select the passage or choose the cut of meat. That's the metaphor. Then we get into and study it. We prep the ingredients. We make sure we understand the original context. We know who the original audience was, what they would have been thinking about, what they would have taken as just kind of common knowledge, and acknowledging that we don't have that same sensitivity today. And then we extract the big idea. We put it all together, and we find out what it yields. What's the meal in store? So that's what we're doing. We're going to start out by selecting the cut. And I must tell you, this week, this is pretty much where we're going to spend most of our time, is just the passage, because unlike in other smaller passages in Mark, this is kind of the entire big idea, is where we focus our gaze. I think I just mentioned we're going to be in Mark chapter 13, verse 24 through 37, but really we're going to back out our gaze a little bit and take in the entire chapter. We mentioned why last week, but we have to identify the sermon or study on some unit of biblical thought, and the fact is, in this particular passage, it's kind of, chapter 13 is one big mega passage called the Olivet Discourse. We covered a portion of it last week. We're going to cover the back end, the second half this week, but in order to really understand it, we have to see it all together in its context. So, yes, technically we're in verses 24 through 37, but it's going to be bigger than that, and we're about to see why. Last week, we were supposed to only go through verse 23. Pastor Don took some liberties, again, because this passage is so big and you can't ignore other parts of chapter 13. He took it all the way to verse 31. So we're going to kind of double back. Some of today's passage is going to sound familiar because he did cover it on Sunday in the message, and so we're going to be going all the way from 24 to the end of 13 and verse 37. And then next week we know we're going to be in Mark 14 because we have a switch in audience. We read that the religious leaders are once again trying to trap Jesus and put him away for good. So that's how we know that we're out of the Olivet Discourse. So let's read God's Word for you, God's people. Mark 13, verses 24 through 37. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be fallen from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the 4 winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, keep awake, but only the Father. Be on guard, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey, when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what shall I say? What I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. This is God's word for you, God's people. We thank God. So our first guess at the big idea, not even going to try. There's too much to look at, too much to take in to even wager a guess right now, because we have to look beyond the passage that we just read. We have to make sure we're reading it in its context of all of chapter 13. So let's do that. We're going to prep the ingredients. We're not going to exactly do it the same way. Normally we would look at the world behind the text, meaning the historical context. We would look at the world within the text, meaning the words, phrases, original languages. And then we'd look at the world before the text, meaning our own proclivities, sensitivities, biases. We would want to make sure that we acknowledge them up front so we know that we're not cheating a little bit. We want to make sure that we're being faithful to the text in its original context. But in order to get to that original context, we're going to really have to focus a lot more on one place, and that's the entirety of chapter 13. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take myself, actually, I can go down the corner here. We're going to look at chapter 13 altogether. You'll recognize the different subsections here. Jesus foretells the destruction of the temple. That's where we started last week. Signs of the end of the age. This is not proof that it's here. It's signs that we are in the beginning of the end. You remember Don mentioned the abomination of desolation, this historical figure that several commentaries, kind of put either as the destruction of the temple proper by the Romans, or maybe it's the Zealots that broke in a few years prior and killed people and appointed one of their own villains to be kind of the chief priest. Many explanations, but that was last week. And then we pick up this week at the coming of the Son of Man, this kind of cosmic conclusion. The sun's darkening, the moon doesn't give its light, stars fall from heaven, the powers of heaven will be shaken. So it's this big macro picture of kind of the end. And then a parable, a lesson of a fig tree. What is that about? And then no one knows the day or hour, and we have another parable on a servant staying awake at the door, making sure that he's ready to receive his master. So what you need to know in terms of keeping this all in perspective is that major scholars believe that, again, Mark is a bit different. In other synoptic gospels, the Olivet Discourse is parallel, but some of these teachings appear in very different places throughout Luke and Matthew, yet Mark has them all woven together, all pulled together, all edited together here for a primary purpose. And so even though they might be in remote places throughout the other Gospels, they're all pulled together here for a purpose. And that purpose does not have to submit to chronological ordering. In fact, I would wager it does not. In fact, Don mentioned that on Sunday in his sermon, is that we're dealing potentially with two different end times. We talked about what's it called? The Left Behind series, the study of I want to say ecclesiology. I'm blanking right now, but the study of end times. It's just not here. Not gonna happen. It'll come in a second. But when we're dealing with the end, whether it's the end of our lives, whether it's the end of humanity, whether it's the end of an age, the temple age, we're dealing with the same word, the same study of the end. And even though it might appear from our perspective in modern day that we're dealing with a bunch of final things, a bunch of the end of the world language, there's a possibility, Don gave three, that I think the A option was that most of what we're reading here actually already happened, already took place, but maybe some of it potentially didn't. Option B would be that some of it could have taken place, but some of it was to come. And then the option C was that none of this stuff has taken place yet. It's all before, not just the original audience, but none of this stuff has actually happened yet for us as a modern audience. And Don said, probably it's option A. Probably most of this has already transpired. It's already taken place, but maybe there's some of it that's still to come. So we're dealing with two different chronologies here. We're dealing with the end of something that happens between Jesus' death in AD 30, 33, and then probably AD 67, 68 to this original audience. And then the final end, the final conclusion, which would be the return of Christ, the final culmination of things. So this is the way that scholars tend to break it up. Even though it looks like we're reading chronologically from verse 1 through verse 37, and that things happen in that order, we're actually jumping around a good bit here. We're doing some literary gymnastics here. It's not obvious unless you do a little homework. The first section here, section A, this is going to be kind of like a symmetrical ordering of passages here. So it's going to be what we intended to cover last week, verses 1 through 23, and it's set apart, it's identified by present tense or by, for the original audience, things that are happening in our lifetime. And we know this by a few phrases here. These things, panta, meaning all things, I'm forgetting on what the Greek word is, but these things, all these things, are referring to kind of like today, in our lifetime, the end. But what we know is that this is not dealing with final things. In fact, if you go back up to the opening two verses, the disciples are commenting on the buildings and saying, oh, what wonderful buildings. And Jesus says they're all going to be thrown down. So the very next thing that the disciples ask is, when will these things be? Meaning, when will this destruction of the temple be? And when are these things, the complete destruction, to be accomplished? So they're not talking about ultimate eschatology. There's the word. They're not talking about final eschatology. They're talking about the end of the temple. And Jesus says, there's going to be some signs, there's going to be some warnings, but the end is not yet. These are but the beginnings of birth pains. So if you've ever been in labor or know someone who has been, you know that when you first start going into labor, there's a good chance that you're not anywhere close to delivery. It takes a while. There's a lot of preparation. There's a lot of time. Some of you are blessed and fortunate to have made it through very quickly. But for most people, there's a prolonged season, probably feels like a season, of your body preparing to give birth. And so Jesus says, these are the signs that you're going into childbirth. This is the beginning of the end. It's not the end. And so that's the way we're going to put this, is these things, when we're talking about these phrases, because you're going to see, you're going to actually see these phrases over and over again throughout chapter 13. These things, these are the end of the temple. So it is an eschatology, but it's a short-term eschatology. It's the end of the temple system, the end of the Jewish way of life as they knew it, the end of the Jewish temple as being the center of religious experience and connection to God. And Jesus has already prophesied this in the escalation discourses with the Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, Herodians. So let me get out of the way. The next passage is B, the coming of the Son of Man. That's what we got into today, this kind of cosmic conclusion language. And here we see, but in those days, after that tribulation. So we're dealing with these things, but these are just the beginning of the birth pains. The end is not yet. but in those days. So what you need to know here, in addition to the fact that now we're dealing with those days after that tribulation, is that this but here is a strong, I guess, opposition. It's almost like a segue into a different idea. Adversative, I think that's the grammatical term for it, is an adversative. So we're really shifting in the thought here. He's telling the disciples, just four of them, here are the signs, it's not the end, here's how you're going to respond. But then he kind of shifts his thought and says, but in those days after that tribulation, so we're dealing with a different line of thinking here, which is why we have shifted from A to B. Now we're dealing with the final destination. Now we're dealing with the final eschatology. And you can tell we're not dealing with wars and rumors of wars, with famine. Now we're dealing with the sun. The lights are going out forever. The sun's darkened, the moon won't give its light, the stars are falling from heaven, the heavens will be shaken, sun and moon coming on clouds. This is kind of like big picture calamity, cosmology. We're dealing with the end, final scene, the final battle. And so we're not dealing with temple end here, temple judgment. We're dealing with the end of the world, life as we know it. Okay, that makes sense. Then we go, okay, so those days and that day marks the end of the world, shift in language. But then we get to the fig tree. And now we're dealing with what we call A prime. And this is going to be kind of a parallel or a mirror image of A, which is the first 23 verses. Okay, well, why is that? Well, because we're back to dealing with these things, this generation, all these things. We're back kind of into present day, present tense recognition. So yes, we're dealing with a fig tree, and that should jog your memory a little bit, because remember, Jesus pronounced judgment over the fig tree, but it was really kind of a metaphor. It was a parable about judgment on the temple. It looked like it had life, it looked like it had fruit, but upon further inspection there was no fruit. It was all show. It was all shock and awe, but there was really nothing there. So now we're back into these things, this generation, these things. We're dealing with the judgment on the temple, the end of the temple. And so when Jesus says, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place, again, as Don mentioned on this past Sunday, this generation referring to probably somewhere within the next 40 years. That's typically how the Jewish mind thought of a generation, is within 40 years from now. And if we're roughly in AD 30 or AD 33, and the temple is destroyed in AD 70, then yeah, that's just about 40 years away. So he's correct. He's right on. So to get myself out of the way again, now we're back into A prime, and these things is kind of like a parable about those signs of not the end, but that the end has begun, the beginning of the end, the birth pains. But then we get to the final paragraph, which the ESV calls "No one knows the day or the hour," and it's identified again by a shifting but, the strongest adversative. But remember, we're shifting our thought from a parable about current day to the parable about the final day, the last day, but concerning that day or that hour. Now, what you would need to know here from a Jewish perspective is that when you see the phrase "in that day," and Don may have actually made reference to this on Sunday as well, in that day, it's kind of looking, it's an apocalyptic, prophetic look at the end. You see this in the prophets like Jeremiah, like Isaiah. You also see it in Daniel. And so whenever you see a reference to "in that day," we're talking about final judgment. So we're not talking about current judgment of the temple. We're talking about final judgment, meaning judgment of all humanity and making all things new, making all things right. So in that day, we're dealing again with another parable, but we're dealing with a parable not about the end of the temple, but a parable about the end of the world. And what he says about it is, no one knows when it's going to be. Don't try to anticipate it. Just be diligent. The angels don't know. The Son doesn't know. Only the Father. So act as if today is the day in terms of your vigilance, in terms of your obedience. Make sure that you maintain the job that you were given. Make sure that you're being found faithful in what the Lord has called you to. So you can tell that looking at chapter 13 as a big picture, it's very hard to cover just one of these passages or a couple of these paragraphs without acknowledging the symmetry. A, B, A prime, B prime, the parables actually perfectly mirror the passages that precede them. The parable of the fig tree is talking about the short-term signs of the temporary or temporal end, and then B and B prime, they're talking about the final end, the final eschatology, those days or that day or in that day. We're talking about end of the world, Christ coming back. And that's not something that as our English mindset, our Western worldview would have us, even though we all are reading the same ESV Bible, and it's great, we're not primed to see things out of order or out of chronological context. So I feel like even though it's a little bit different from the format that we typically take in meal prep, you have to see the relationship between those original ideas and the following parables in order to understand that last week Don primarily covered the passage on the signs, the warnings, the temporary temporal calamities, the earthquakes, the famines, the harsh circumstances that Jesus says, hey, there's signs that something's happening, but that's not the end. It's just a sign that God has this, and you can rest, even though there's unrest, even though there's hardship. I'm telling you all of these things with advance warning so that you can take comfort in the fact that God's still in control. And then this week we're shifting to the B passages. We're shifting to the cosmic conclusion, the final destination, the ultimate end, the kingdom being permanently established, and all injustice and evil everywhere being finally punished. Christ coming back, redeeming his church, his bride, and then putting to death once and for all. This week, absolutely, Pillar Commentary is great, but if I were to give you just one resource, I would say it's the Gospel of Mark, a socio-rhetorical commentary by Ben Witherington. The reason is because this is the Olivet Discourse. It's the Olivet Sermon or Preach, and sermon or speech, not preach. And because this is a rhetorical commentary and Jesus is steeped in a particular type of rhetoric or methodology, Ben Witherington does a great job at explaining the Olivet Discourse in depth and then talking about this relationship between A prime, B prime. So if you're going to only spend a few moments and you could only have one commentary, I would definitely go for the second one this week. So what's the big idea? As always, the subject and the complement are going to yield something called the exegetical idea or the extracted idea. We're not wanting to read something into this passage, we're wanting to get it out. What was the original audience intended to receive, and how do we understand it for then and there so that then we can understand what it means to us here and now? The subject is always stated in the form of a question, and the question hanging over all of chapter 13, or maybe more precisely, the question hanging over the B and B prime sections, for me, I put it as, how do we prepare for the end of the world? Or you could say, how do Jesus' followers, whether it's then and there or here and now, how do we prepare for the end of the world? The answer given is the complement, and it is stay awake. Jesus says, be vigilant, stay awake, be on your guard. He says it several times throughout chapter 13. And he says it regardless of whether we're in the A sections or we're in the B sections. It's the same wisdom in both senses. But that does answer our question. Stay awake, be vigilant, be ready, be on your guard. So putting it all together, what's the big idea? God's people prepare for the end through persistent, vigilant service, going for that second parable. The door holder, awaiting his master's return, regardless of if he comes back in the evening or overnight or in the wee hours of the morning or the next day. Always ready, always there at the door, ready to anticipate the return of the master. So persistent, vigilant service, not through rampant speculation about when it's going to happen. So, let's see. That's it. Gospel according to Mark. I think that's all we have for today. I'm going to go ahead and cut it there and let you guys go ahead and do any homework. Follow up with that Ben Witherington commentary. Absolutely wonderful article on the Olivet Discourse. Highly recommend it. And we will see you this coming Sunday. I hope you guys had a great time at the Chili Cook-Off. It was so much fun. Congratulations to Mike Martin, the chili champion. I think 2 out of the 3 of our winners were actually new members from the past year, which is kind of awesome. It just shows how the church is growing in a real healthy way based on certain metrics. We love you, church. Have a great one. We'll see you Sunday at the Baxter Close YMCA. If you can't make it in person, we're also on Facebook, YouTube, the Eternal Church website, and the Eternal